Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking you for the invitation to speak this evening. Lublin is perhaps not the most obvious destination for someone who lives in a village in southeast Scotland, but I'm pleased to say that this is the third time that I've had the good fortune to find myself in this city. On the two previous occasions, both in 2007, I was en route to Zamość. The first to research a feature article that later appeared in the UNESCO Review World Heritage. The second to speak and contribute to the teaching at that year's UNESCO Zamość Summer School. Those two visits to Lublin were short, just a few hours each, and this visit is giving me the chance to see much more of the city and to meet a broader cross-section of its inhabitants. The world is not the same place that any of us adults were born into. I do not, in the context of this evening, mean socio-politically, rather culturally, economically, and environmentally. When it comes to urban planning and architecture, we are still living in the shadow of the brave new world and modernism. When it comes to the key global agendas of our time, we are challenged by sustainability and climate change. When we consider the concept of globalization, we are also addressing the converse, localization, cultural diversity, and humanity's infinitely rich and continuously evolving expressions of intangible cultural heritage, including down to the smallest scale. And when we are debating the title of this lecture, Visual Integrity versus Economic Development, we have to bring some clarity to the distinction between economic development as a boom and bust phenomenon and sustainable development in the full meaning of that term. They are not the same, as I shall seek to explain. Alternative urban planning models, conflict versus harmony. The Western model for post-industrial cities. In response to the negative imagery of the 19th century English and French industrial city, as portrayed in literature, including the novels of Charles Dickens and Émile Zola, and the visual arts, notably the engravings of Gustave Doré, two interrelated models have acted as the drivers for urban planning across much of the Western world. Firstly, the garden city, the simplistic two-dimensional quasi-sociological concept of land use separation for new towns and cities according to housing, recreation, industry and circulation that was devised by Ebenezer Howard in England. Secondly, the modern movement's interpretation and promotion of this concept as the basis for the reconstruction of historic cities according to the same formula of living, recreation, working and transportation as famously taken up by Le Corbusier in France. His 1925 Plan Voisin, for example, illustrated the rebuilding of Paris in its entirety, with the sole exception of a handful of key monuments such as the Louvre Palace, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe and the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. His model for the reconstruction of the Marais Quarter, the 17th century fashionable aristocratic quarter with its hundreds of town mansions, public and private gardens, proposed its replacement by 18 office-use skyscrapers. The legacy of this Western model is urban dispersal and transport dependence, the concentration of volatile redevelopment pressures in historic city centres, their most sensitive parts, the loss of material fabric and socio-economic identity, and inner-city neighbourhoods that have frequently become the focus for degradation and socio-economic problems. This model places the historic and modern city in fundamental conflict. Alternative vision of complementary development. Gustavo Giovannoni architect planner, restorer and teacher based in Italy, focused his prolific published output on the interrelationship between the historic and modern city at all levels, from the strategic to the detail of practice. He pioneered the idea of mutually supportive, harmonious coexistence, arguing that the correct response was to understand and work with the respective complementary qualities and opportunities of each. Giovannoni characterized the historic city by its compactness, the pedestrian pace and rhythm of life, the small scale of its urban grain and public spaces, the close proximity of its many different activities, its distinctive socio-economic role and vibrancy, and its contextual homogeneity. And he characterized the modern city by its possibilities of limitless expansion, its faster pace and dynamism related to non-pedestrian forms of movement, the openness and larger scale of its urban layout, buildings and spaces, and its lack of contextuality, hence its freedom from design constraint. Giovannoni opposed Le Corbusier's espousal of the garden city as the response to the challenge of the historic city as simplistic and outdated. He was equally opposed to the embalming of historic cities for historical, aesthetic, or tourist objectives. Giovannoni exercised a seminal influence upon the course of urban planning and the adaptation of historic cities in Italy following both the First and Second World Wars, and his thesis found common ground in France and Spain. Formative literature. Key early 20th century literature that recognized the qualities of urbanity and citizenship inherent in historic cities includes Cities in Evolution by Patrick Geddes, first published in 1915, and Vecchi Città ed Edilizia Nuova by Gustavo Giovannoni, published in 1931 and translated and edited in French as L'Urbanisme face aux villes anciennes in 1998. The theme has been taken up far more recently by others as a guide for new urban developments that conform with today's agendas of sustainable development, including the 1999 Charter of the New Urbanism. The terminology of heritage. I should explain, I don't normally read from a text, but it makes it so much easier for a translator to have it beforehand and to stick to it. Over the past 40 years, there has been a progressive shift in the terminology of heritage. The 1972 World Heritage Convention, for example, had only 3 classifications for cultural heritage properties, namely monuments, groups of buildings, and sites. This reflected a primarily monumental and aesthetic approach to physical objects in isolation from their socio-economic and human contexts. Today, the UNESCO operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention define inhabited historic towns, a far more meaningful concept with which to work, but a far more complex one when it comes to devising effective instruments for their protection. In addition, the spectrum of UNESCO conventions has been enlarged to encompass intangible cultural heritage in 2003 and cultural diversity in 2005, and the initiative on historic urban landscapes, which was commenced in 2005, is ongoing.